Today's video was made possible with the help of my patrons. Head on over to the link in the description to receive your exclusive benefits. Henry the Green Engine has lived on the island of Sodor for many years. He wouldn't want to be anywhere else. He loves every part of it, from the fields of green to the white sandy beaches. Here we go, the Big Green himself finally gets the spotlight. Now Henry is going to be an interesting character for me to talk about, as he has both a selection of some really awesome and beloved episodes, but he also has a ton of stinkers. Fortunately, we're only focusing on the good ones. As always, be sure to let me know what your favourite episodes spotlighting the titular number 3 are down in the comments. And of course, if you enjoy this video and want to see more like it, then don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and ring Toby's bell to stay notified for when I post new content. Now with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Number 10. Something in the Air. We're starting off strong with a Season 5 episode. Henry didn't have that many spotlight roles in this season, having only 2, but both were absolute doozies. Interestingly enough, this is an episode where he shares the spotlight with another character, that being Thomas. Season 5 Thomas, aka the Goated Thomas.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
I've talked before about the fact that I love the more mature and grown up version of Thomas in Season 5, so I won't repeat myself, but what I will say is that I love the Thomas and Henry dynamic, and I wish that it had been played with more. Back in Season 1, Thomas was the one who was rude to Henry.
"Rubbish," said Thomas. "You're too fat, you need exercise."
Now the tables have turned, and Henry is the rude one.
"And there's danger on the rails, that's why we're late." "Huh, you're the only danger on the rails, Thomas."
Character personalities aside though, this episode is all atmosphere and scenery. The daytime shots of the coastal line are crisp and beautiful, and the nighttime shots with the fog and that intense musical build-up are nerve-wracking. It's like we all know that Henry is going to have an accident, and there's nothing that can be done about it. All we can do is watch in terror and suspense and wait for the crash to happen. I'm amazed that Henry's model still worked after being submerged in water like that. I know that there's a bit of a debate on the whole issue with Henry being scolded by the Fat Controller and Thomas not fully explaining the danger, so I'll offer my 10 cents on the scene. I always interpreted this as Thomas deciding not to bother trying to explain the situation fully to Henry because he just knew that the Green Engine would dismiss him and ignore him anyway, which would have still resulted in the crash happening. So, Thomas just decided to save his breath and spare himself the headache. Can't say that I wouldn't have done the same, to be honest. Usual Bloke Luke has done an excellent video talking about this episode in detail, and I can't really elaborate any further without parodying him. So I suggest you go watch it, link is in the description. From excellent uses of music and practical effects, to great character interactions, Something in the Air is one of numerous examples of just how cinematic and nail-biting Season 5 could be. Number 9. Coal. Let me ask you guys something. When you were growing up, or even now, I won't judge, were there any elements of Thomas that scared you, even though they weren't intended to be scary? There certainly was for me. For me, it was Henry's sad face, in combination with his sad theme. But here's the weird thing, this was only the case with Old Shape Henry. I've no idea why, but it terrified me. Now picture this scenario. I had never seen this episode before, and only knew that Henry had special coal because I had seen the Flying Kipper. Then, I stumbled across a VHS tape with a season 1 episode called Coal that I had never heard of before, so you can bet that I was excited and intrigued to watch it. So I get all cozy and snuggled up in bed at night, ready to watch this new episode, and the first shot is... BAM! Yeah, I dive straight under the sheets. I can't help but smirk whenever I watch this episode and think back to that moment. Jokes aside though, this episode is great in itself. It's a real representation of someone who has a disability trying out different treatments in the hopes of finding some form of relief. Again, this is something that Luke has also touched on. But aside from that, this is the first time we see Henry in a truly sympathetic light. Prior to this, Henry was almost always rude and got his comeuppance as a result. He did get a small redemption at one point prior, but he blew that when he joined the others in going on strike. And while Thomas and the guard does put him in a position of sympathy, we don't really know what's wrong with him, as the episode is focused on Thomas, so there's no time to dwell on it. This time, however, we can't help but feel sorry for Henry. And it's such a joyous occasion when we see the coal take effect and Henry finally has a good day, in what must be the first time in ages. There is also of course the hilarious blip in the restored version where the editor somehow used the wrong clip of Henry's model smashing into the station building. You didn't think I was going to forget that, did you? Coal is the first piece of Henry's own little trilogy in season 1, and it was a great start to it. It's an episode that makes the audience really root for Henry despite all of his shortcomings, while also providing some insight into why he's such an asshole at times. I honestly can't say that I wouldn't be much different if I had Henry's health issues. As for Henry being rude after all his health problems are fixed, well, some habits die hard, I guess. Number 8. Henry and the Elephant. Henry only got 2 major appearances in season 4, and in both of them, he becomes the butt of the joke. I'm placing this episode in the list though, because Paint Pots and Queens is much more befitting another big tender engine. This episode is played out just for humour. The whole concept of Henry being pushed by an elephant is so ridiculous. As Gordon would put it,
first the rain, then an elephant. Whatever will you be afraid of next?
There are other good moments too. The circus train has some great props, and that scene where James gets to pull the train as Gordon and Henry are looking pissed off is great. It's just another slap in the face to poor Henry. Also, the scene where the workmen head into the tunnel is kind of eerie. It always had me on the edge of my seat as a kid. Like yeah, it's pretty obvious in hindsight what's in there thanks to the title of the episode, but I think this had the potential to be made into a spooky themed episode. Like, imagine if it was Halloween and the circus was appropriately decorated. You know what? Someone needs to do that. Someone should make an adaptation of this in Trains and try to make it as spoopy as possible. Henry and the Elephant is just a funny episode with a charming and yet soppy ending.
Never mind, Henry, murmured Thomas. I think you were brave today and really reliable too.
Number 7. Henry's Hero. Ah yes, Henry's best CGI episode, pairing him up with objectively the best CGI character. Everyone has seen this episode and everyone knows why it's great. Not only is this the closest thing to an actual super rescue adaptation that Henry has received, but it's one of those gems that features 2 protagonists that are simultaneously in the right and the wrong, with both learning from each other. We start off rooting for Hero, but when Henry comes back in the second act, we join Hero in cheering him on. It does have the worrisome Henry that the CGI series is known for flanderizing, but I think it actually works in the context of this episode, and especially when you take Henry's history into account. No matter what era of the franchise you are consuming, Henry has consistently been shown to have a history of bad luck with coal. Henry and Hero are a great duo together. I'm sure like many others, would have loved to have seen them paired up more. Hell, Hero should have been paired up with more characters, period. Also, this episode features the return of Duck. CGI Henry had it rough more often than not, but this episode is undoubtedly a diamond that can be found within. Number 6. Edward, Gordon and Henry. I know that this one is more of an ensemble episode, but it does serve as a sequel to an actual Henry story. Plus, Henry is the most noteworthy character in it. This episode serves as both a satisfying conclusion to Henry's debut story, with a nice redemption arc thrown in for good measure. Something that I especially like about this one is the use of Henry's theme. While we did hear it for the first time in the previous episode where Henry debuted, that was done more so that we can associate the theme with him. Its triumphant melody didn't really match the scenario presented. Nothing wrong with that, of course, as it was meant to show us that this is a new character that we were being introduced to. But now in this one, the triumph of Henry and Edward rescuing the Express is amplified as a result. The scene where the Fat Controller loses his hat is hilarious, of course. Also, that ditty that plays when Henry laughs at Gordon always gets me.
And look, there's Henry laughing at me.
Henry has some really funny moments in the show there now that I'm thinking about it. Now I know that the original book that this story was in wasn't intended to go far, but I do wish the trio of Edward, Gordon and Henry had been explored more. I also think that maybe having a couple of episodes in between this one and the prior could have helped work to sell the illusion of time a bit better. But I digress, the episode doesn't really suffer for it. In short, this episode offers a fun and satisfying conclusion to the beginning of Henry's story, and makes us want to see more of him. Awesome. Number 5. Haunted Henry. Ah yes, that episode, one of the spookiest ones to date. You all know why this episode is good. It's pure chills throughout. Everything about this episode is great. That POV shot with Henry rolling past the dead trees sent shivers down my spine the first time I saw it. The narration from both narrators is excellent. I especially love how ominous Michael Angelis sounds here.
Who's there?
No one replied.
The music is chilling and intense all the way through, and still manages to be frightening even when the action ramps up. What else? The crash is awesome, and the scene where Henry gets spooked by Gordon passing is, would you have guessed it, hilarious. Who else wishes that we could have seen that deleted scene with him? I'm sure he's just teasing Henry for being scared, but I still would like to have seen it. I also really like the introduction of Old Bailey. I think that he's an interesting character, and would have definitely liked to have seen more of him, as the fandom have done some really excellent episodes of their own using him. He's such a mysterious figure. After all, he, along with Edward, are essentially catalysts for the episode's plot. Edward mentions the ghost, then Old Bailey leaves quite literal signs that make us question if Edward was right. There's a lot that could have been done with Old Bailey, but alas, I'm still happy with what we got. Henry only had 2 spotlight roles in season 5, but man, were they great. Number 4. Whistles and Sneezes. This episode is a good example of how to combine 2 book stories into a single episode, which is something that season 1 excelled at. Both of the original stories used the theme of Henry overcoming bully-esque characters, and as a result, the episode flows very well. I have to admit that the first half of the episode is what does it for me. The scene with Gordon and his whistle is just pure laughs. I do find it a little odd that Henry tells Edward what he had said at the beginning of the episode, considering, Edward was right there. I don't know, maybe he left before Gordon got a chance to speak. This episode is also notable for being the first one to star New Shape Henry from start to finish. I like the clever way that Henry gets his own back at the boys who threw stones at him. They won't be trying that again anytime soon. Also, what is up with Henry's stuffed up face? I also think it's neat that the show creators actually went to the effort of giving the coaches broken windows. They could have easily just kept the camera up front, but nope. Nice attention to detail there. Also, this is another one of those episodes with that goated Season 1 sunset. Mwah! Chef's kiss. All in all, this episode serves as a satisfying climax to Henry's story in Season 1. Having started as someone really unlikable and falling from grace multiple times, to becoming triumphant and someone we want to root for, you can't skip this episode. After all, it isn't wrong, but we just don't do it. Number 3. Henry's Forest. Ah yes, the beauty that is Season 3. The season that fine-tuned everything and explored new sides of the characters. This is where we finally get to explore Henry's character on a deeper level. While he may appear to be just as rude and grumpy on the surface as his fellow big engines, deep down, Henry is a gentle giant that adores nature. This episode has it all. Beautiful sunsets, calm and serene music, and fantastic visuals. This episode reminds me a lot of when I was a kid. I grew up and still live in a suburban town, and I've spent a lot of time walking through various nature paths. As a kid, I always imagined these paths as railway lines, and I would be driving my own engine along them. I know that Audrey hated this episode for ignoring real railway practice, but this doesn't detract from the quality of the story, which I was pleasantly surprised to find out was originally written by Andrew Brenner of all people, as a magazine story. Interesting that he did Thomas related work this early into the game. Also, this is a tad random, but I really like those trucks that the trees are carried in too. Wish we could have seen more of them. This episode has a special place in my heart. Whenever I go for a nature walk, I think of Henry's Forest. Whenever I watch Henry's Forest, I think of those times I imagine myself driving an engine through whatever woodland area I was walking in as a kid. This episode is synonymous with my childhood. Number 2. The Flying Kipper. Okay, I know that it's sacrilege to put Henry's definitive best episode as my number 2, but what can I say? There's one episode that stands out to me more. No one can deny that this episode is absolutely stellar. Well, I mean, they can, but they'd be wrong. Taking place almost entirely at night and dawn already makes this episode the most unique among everything else in Season 1. I only get up early in the mornings because I have to go to work. It's not something I do by choice, but if every morning was like this, hell yeah, I'd be getting up bright and early. Well, maybe for a couple of days. Hey, I'm a night owl at heart, alright? This episode is just so atmospheric, and that remix of Henry's theme, beautiful. They could have simply reused Henry's original theme, and it would have worked fine. But nope, Mike and Junior went all out with this one. There are many other reasons as to why this episode sticks out with fans. It has the first on-screen crash of the entire show. We get to follow Henry on his journey, and thus it feels like we're actually travelling with him. And of course, we finally get to see Henry in his new shape, thus meaning that his struggle with his handicap is finally over. Oddly enough, I somehow struggled to tell the difference between Henry's two shapes as a kid, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because they didn't change his tender in the show and just kept his old one, as opposed to the books? Much like the unlucky Tug, I think that this episode beats out the original story, as it plays out much more seriously when it comes to the crash. I love that realism, and I'm curious as to how many people feel the same way. Which version do you guys prefer? The book or the episode? Regardless of which one you go with, the Flying Kipper is fantastic and gives Henry the much needed respite that he was sorely lacking in his old shape. Fret not, Henry, you finally overcome the very thing that was holding you back. Number 1. The Sad Story of Henry. Since the Flying Kipper was my number 2, you guys probably guessed that this was my number 1. It's the one that sticks out the most to me whenever I think of Henry or Season 1. It's definitely the most notorious episode of the show on the internet, albeit for the wrong reasons. Remember when I said during the coal section that the intro scared me? Well, there's another episode that did the same thing, and this was it. That building the wall theme always gave me chills as a kid. Whenever I watched my Thomas VHS tapes back then, I always shuddered when I knew this episode was coming, because the image of Henry alone in the tunnel, even before the wall was built, I don't know. The sight of Henry covered in dirt and dust and whatever else really makes him look like he's been there for a while. And while I'm fine now, I couldn't help feeling so horrified as a kid, and yet I always forced myself to watch the episode because I didn't want to miss anything. In hindsight though, and in concept, the story is very silly, and quite frankly, laughable in some aspects. If this didn't come from the first book of the Railway series, I doubt Audrey would have written something so far-fetched. The scenes where everyone tries to pull and push the train out of the tunnel are so amusing. Like, how did they not know that wouldn't work? Silly gimmicks and childhood memories aside, this episode is super fascinating due to all the media surrounding it. I really wish that we could have seen the original attempt at turning this episode into a pilot series all those decades ago. Still holding out hope that one day someone might reveal a tape of it, however unlikely. Even if the sad story of Henry isn't your favourite episode starring the Big Green Engine, it's hard to deny just how memorable it is. And it's quite possibly the most memorable debut story for any character in the franchise. And there you have it, folks. Henry has definitely had his ups and downs throughout the years, but when he does get a good episode, man does it hit hard. What are your favourite Henry focused episodes? As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed this video. Now until next time, I've been Sinners and Ashes UK, you've been awesome, and have a great day. Bye!